The town lay under a sky stretched thin with gold, the kind of sunset that seemed to weigh on your chest and whisper secrets into the wind. Dust curled along the edges of the streets, carrying with it the faint scent of hay and worn leather. Wooden boards creaked under the hesitant steps of late stragglers, their shadows long and trembling as if the day itself were reluctant to leave. Somewhere, a horse shifted, and the soft clatter of hooves against dirt reminded the town of its own quiet heartbeat. She moved among them, carrying herself with a grace that betrayed both strength and a quiet sorrow. Her hands, though small, bore the memory of toil, scraping, cleaning, mending. She was young, barely 23, but life had already carved deep lines into the soft curves of her face. The town had learned to underestimate her, seeing her as delicate, fragile, but those who watched closely could see the flame behind her eyes, the stubborn pulse of dignity that refused to be snuffed out. The first man passed by, mid-30s, broad-shouldered and too sure of his charm. He tipped his hat with a smile meant to flatter, but it felt hollow, brittle as the cracked boards of the old saloon. He spoke words that brushed against her like dry wind, teasing, testing, daring. She met him with silence, or perhaps a slow, measured nod that spoke more than any reply could. The townsfolk, ever watchful, whispered behind curtained windows. The first man's pride, sharp as a whip crack, had already found friction in the presence of someone who would not bend. From the edge of the street, where the dust thinned into the open plains, a rider appeared. He was taller than most, his shoulders wide but not imposing, his movements deliberate. A rancher, they would later say, though at this moment he was simply a silhouette framed in the last amber of sunlight. His horse moved quietly, carrying him with a patience that mirrored his gaze. His eyes, sharp but calm, seemed to measure the land as if it were a story being written in the soil, and when they flicked toward her, they lingered with an understanding that startled even the wind. She noticed him first in the corner of her eye, a shadow that did not hurry, that did not demand attention, yet somehow commanded it. The world felt smaller, tighter, as if the horizon itself leaned in to watch their brief acknowledgement. There was no rush, no flourish of grand gestures, just a slow nod, a tilt of the head, and a glance that said, "I see you." And in that simple act, her heart, weary and wary, stirred in ways she had long forgotten were possible. The town continued its slow hum. Windows rattled under the evening breeze. The blacksmith's hammer rang faintly, carrying a metallic song across the empty streets. Children, unaware of the weight of eyes upon them, chased one another in the dust, their laughter like fleeting sparks against the settling dusk. She paused to straighten a crooked fence post, her fingers brushing the rough wood, grounding herself against the whirlwind of glances and unspoken judgments. Even the first man noticed, though his eyes were clouded with the ease of ignorance. He had assumed she would falter under scrutiny, that she would yield to the rhythm of expectation. But she did not. She moved with a quiet certainty, her presence a contradiction to the town's assumptions, fragile and unyielding all at once. The rancher watched from the edge, a silent witness, noting the resilience in her posture, the way she carried herself without demand for approval. The moment stretched, slow as molasses in the fading light, a delicate pause between one heartbeat and the next. Wind carried faint whispers, voices of the past, of those who had walked these streets before. The sun dipped lower, painting everything with the color of memory, as if the land itself wanted to preserve this instant. And in that instant, she felt seen, not as a fragile girl, not as a curiosity, but as someone who mattered. She returned to her chores, yet the echo of his presence lingered like a half-remembered song. Her hands continued their work, brushing away dust, tying hay, smoothing rough edges. Each gesture was deliberate, steady, filled with a silent dignity that refused to be diminished. She wondered, briefly, about the rider, about the quiet certainty in his movements, and for a moment allowed herself the dangerous luxury of curiosity. And then the first man spoke again, his tone sharp against the gentle cadence of the town, drawing a small ripple of attention. Words meant to provoke, to assert control, spilled into the soft evening air. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch, thick and patient, a language the first man did not know how to read. The rancher's presence, just beyond reach, seemed to whisper with the wind. Some things are better left unspoken. Some truths unfold in their own time. Night began to gather its quiet cloak over the town, and as lanterns flickered to life in wooden windows, the heroine paused to look toward the horizon. The rancher's figure had faded into the dusky gold, but the imprint of his gaze lingered, a gentle shock to a world used to predictable rhythms. She could feel the stirrings of something unfamiliar, a cautious hope, an uneasy trust, a promise written in the language of wind and dust. And in that lingering twilight, with the town holding its breath and the plains stretching endlessly beyond, the story began, not with a shout, not with spectacle, but with a quiet glance, a patient observation, and the unspoken understanding that some events, some people, carry within them the power to reshape hearts without ever raising a hand. Morning arrived like a whispered promise, soft and pale, spilling silver over the undulating plains. Mist clung to the low valleys, curling around fence posts and the hooves of grazing horses, as though the earth itself exhaled a quiet sigh. The town stirred slowly, reluctant to break the fragile hush of dawn. Wooden shutters creaked, a dog barked somewhere beyond the hill, and the distant chiming of the blacksmith's bell signaled the day's beginning. She moved along the dirt paths, the dust from yesterday settling into the curves of her boots. Her hair, a rich chestnut, caught the sun's first light, glinting like threads of copper woven through silk. She was 23, though life had already carved experiences into the delicate planes of her face. Her eyes, steady and observant, took in the town with quiet care, the way a bird notices each branch it alights upon before it trusts to flight. The rancher was near, though he did not announce himself. From the ridge above the town, he surveyed the fields and fences, the subtle patterns of life as they stretched across the land. He was 34, tall, quiet, with shoulders broad enough to carry burdens, yet never leaning on them for show. Every motion he made was deliberate, measured, a reflection of patience honed by years of solitary understanding. His eyes caught hers briefly as she straightened a stray bundle of hay, and in that glance, an unspoken acknowledgement passed between them, a recognition not of need, but of presence. The first man stirred as well, his impatience already visible in the set of his jaw. Mid-30s, with charm polished by vanity and convenience, he sought to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Words dripped from his tongue like hot dust, designed to provoke a reaction, to bend the world to his assumptions. She did not flinch. Her calm deflected his theatrics like sunlight dispersing over water. He watched her, puzzled, his confidence rattled by the quiet fortitude she carried like a second skin. The morning stretched its light across the town slowly, and in that soft glow, the rancher made small interventions, acts unnoticed by many, yet resonant to those who looked closely. He guided a stumbling child away from the path of a stray horse, quietly fixed a broken wheel on a cart without fanfare, and in each gesture revealed the gentle precision of a man whose strength was never meant to dazzle. Even the dust seemed to part politely around him, yielding to the rhythm of his steady steps. Curiosity drew her closer, a quiet tug in the depths of her chest. She found herself observing the rancher from the shade of a wooden awning, noting the patience in the way he tended to the land, the care with which he approached each small task. He did not seek recognition. He did not demand it. And yet, in the way he moved, she felt an odd reassurance, a steady pulse that contradicted the disorder of the world around them. The first man, noticing her attention, approached with a swagger meant to impress. He spoke too loudly, too quickly, words clattering against the morning calm like stones tossed into a still pond. She allowed silence to answer, letting the unbroken rhythm of her breath speak in place of the tongue. The rancher observed from a distance, quiet as the wind threading through the grass, and in that quiet, the town seemed to hold its breath as a moment arose between them. She, the first man, and the rancher, small and imperceptible to the casual eye. The town buzzed with curiosity, watching the patterns of interaction unfold, yet misunderstanding the language of subtlety. She could feel the contrast, the shallow weight of the first man's attention, the quiet gravity of the rancher's observation. Her heart, cautious and weary, responded not to noise, but to the steadiness that did not demand her surrender. The day passed in this gentle cadence. They met in fleeting glances, brief nods, and unremarkable coincidences, reaching for the same bundle of hay, stepping aside on a narrow path, pausing to watch a hawk wheel across the sky. Each act, though simple, was a thread in a tapestry being woven slowly, deliberately. She began to sense that the rancher's presence was not coincidental. It was a quiet assertion of care in a world that often overlooked the fragile by afternoon. The first man's impatience had grown into a brittle display, a clumsy attempt at dominance that betrayed the emptiness of his intentions. She met his gaze only once, with eyes clear and unyielding, and turned back to her tasks. The rancher's figure appeared in the distance, walking along the fence line, as if to lend an unspoken reinforcement to her quiet dignity. The town watched, some with admiration, others with suspicion, yet none could deny the gravity in his measured steps. Evening arrived, carrying a softer hue than the night before, painting the buildings and fields in lilac and amber. She paused at the edge of the field, inhaling the scent of freshly turned soil and horse sweat, the smell of a land alive with memory. The rancher joined her at a deliberate distance, neither pressing nor distant, simply existing in the same space. They did not speak immediately. Words were unnecessary in the presence of shared understanding. The moment held, a communion without sound, a recognition of the strength it took to move through a world that often undervalued courage and quiet grace. For the first time that day, she allowed herself a smile, small, careful, a whisper of something tender she had kept locked inside. The rancher returned it, a subtle inclination of the head, an acknowledgement that spoke more than any words could. The first man, noticing the exchange, flushed with a quiet frustration, realizing that his performative gestures could not compete with the weight of genuine presence. As shadows lengthened and the town settled into the gentle embrace of night, she felt a stirring of something dangerous and wonderful: trust, curiosity, perhaps even hope. The rancher remained a figure at the periphery, a quiet certainty that had arrived unannounced, reshaping the contours of her day without fanfare, without demand, leaving only the promise of something yet to come. And in that suspended dusk, the town continued its slow hum, oblivious to the subtle revolution unfolding in the space between glances, between dust, between the patient cadence of two lives beginning to recognize each other. The story, slow as the turning of the seasons, had begun to deepen its roots. Twilight descended like a sigh, stretching shadows long and soft across the town. The sky wore a deepening purple, smudged with the last traces of gold, as if the day itself were reluctant to release its hold. Dust lingered in the air, catching the fading light and turning every movement into a quiet dance of motes and memory. She walked along the main street, her steps slow, deliberate. Her hands carried traces of work, the faint smell of hay, earth, and leather clinging to skin that had learned to endure. She was 23, yet there was a patience in her posture that felt older than her years, a calm resilience that had grown from knowing the world could be harsh and small-minded. The first man lingered nearby, his presence a sharp contrast to the gentle rhythm of the town. His temper, thinly veiled beneath the mask of charm, had grown brittle through the day. He sought to provoke, to assert dominance over what he did not understand, yet she met him with quiet steadiness, the calm eye of a storm that would not break. The rancher, 34, arrived not with spectacle, but with deliberate steps. He did not rush, did not call attention to himself, yet his presence carried a weight that the town could not ignore. He moved toward a small gathering near the edge of the town square. A boy had trapped his hand in the wheel of a cart, his cries sharp and panicked. The first man hesitated, unsure of what to do, his bravado faltering. The heroine's heart clenched as she watched, instinct urging action, yet the moment seemed poised on a knife's edge. The rancher acted, not with force, not with loud gestures, but with calm, assured hands. He knelt beside the boy, murmuring something soft and steady. The world seemed to slow as he freed the trapped hand, his fingers brushing the boy's knuckles, lingering only long enough to reassure. The town, previously unaware of the depth of his character, gasped quietly. The first man's jaw tightened, realizing that courage was not in loud declarations but in the patient, precise bending of a world that demanded recklessness. She approached him then, drawn by the quiet certainty in his actions. Her own hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the anticipation of connection. The rancher looked up, eyes meeting hers, and in that gaze was a recognition that startled her, an acknowledgement of her strength, her careful courage, her quiet dignity. No words were needed. The first man, emboldened by jealousy or pride, spoke sharply, his voice cutting through the lingering murmurs of the crowd. He attempted to belittle the act, to reduce it to spectacle, but the town's eyes had shifted. They had witnessed something that could not be dismissed, a quiet bravery that spoke louder than words that a hush fell. The boy, now freed, clung briefly to his mother, the faintest smile flickering across both their faces. The heroine, still standing, felt a strange warmth settle in her chest, a recognition of safety, of trust, of being seen. And the rancher, neither boastful nor seeking reward, simply stepped back, his presence still steady, his calm a subtle defiance against the expectations of a small, gossipy town. Evening deepened, turning the town square into a tableau of muted gold and shadow. Lanterns flickered on, casting gentle light on the worn wooden facades, the dust settling like memory itself across the ground. The first man slunk away, defeated not by words but by the quiet revelation that strength and courage could exist without pretense, that gentleness could command respect in ways he had never understood. The heroine and the rancher walked together along the edge of town, unspoken conversation flowing between them like water. The air was cool, scented with distant pine and the faint tang of livestock. No one else was close enough to hear their thoughts, yet every glance, every subtle nod, communicated volumes. She felt the stirrings of a bond built not on spectacle or immediate attraction, but on patience, understanding, and the recognition of the soul beneath appearances. He showed her small kindnesses along the way, helping steady a loose fence post, adjusting a harness without a word, pausing to watch the sky turn slowly from purple to deep indigo. Each gesture was deliberate, precise, a careful layering of trust and care. She responded in kind, her laughter soft but real, her smiles slow to bloom but genuine, warmed by the realization that someone had arrived who neither underestimated nor demanded her. The townsfolk observed from windows and doorways, some whispering admiration, others murmuring disbelief. The first man lingered for a moment longer, seeing not triumph but his own limitations reflected in the quiet bond forming before him. Even he could not deny the honesty in it, though pride would keep him from speaking acknowledgement aloud. Night fully descended, and the pair remained walking, their steps synchronized without intention. Stars appeared, faint at first, then bold, illuminating the vast expanse beyond the town. The wind carried with it a gentle memory, a reminder that life, though often harsh, held moments of quiet heroism, of courage expressed not in violence but in steadfast care. They paused at the edge of a low hill overlooking the town. The lights below flickered softly, the last traces of human activity winding down. She glanced at him, and he returned her look, not with words but with understanding, the kind that seeps into your bones and leaves you forever changed. The shocking act of the day had not been loud, not violent, but it had shaken the town, altered the course of perception, and, most importantly, opened a space for her heart to breathe. In the stillness, she realized that the world could be defied not through rebellion or noise, but through the quiet, deliberate actions of someone who chooses care over cruelty, steadiness over spectacle, and understanding over judgment. The rancher's hands, gentle yet resolute, had done what the first man never could. And in that moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life where trust could grow, where safety could exist, and where the heart could bloom in a world that had long expected it to remain closed. The stars above carried a hush, and she let the quiet sink into her, letting the wind carry away fear and uncertainty. The night whispered a promise, that even in a world quick to judge and slow to understand, courage could bloom softly, gently, and leave a mark that endured far beyond the moment. Dawn crept over the horizon, soft as a whispered apology, spilling gold and rose across the prairie. The town, still wrapped in the quiet of night, seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that something had shifted beneath its dusty streets and wooden facades. The air smelled of dew, of fresh earth, of beginnings. She stood at the edge of the fields, feeling the cool morning brush her cheeks, her hands folded loosely before her. 23, yet older in the ways that matter. She had learned that courage was not in the loud claim of one's presence, but in quiet endurance, in steadfastness when the world expected collapse. Her eyes searched the horizon, not for spectacle, but for the steady shape she had come to trust. He approached, slow, deliberate, the rancher's tall frame silhouetted against the rising sun. 34. His presence was calm, yet undeniable, a steady force in a world often unkind to those who dared gentleness. He did not speak immediately, allowing the hush of morning to carry meaning between them. In his gaze was acknowledgement, deep and patient, that the trials of the town, the whispers, and the shallow judgments had no claim over their bond. The shocking act that had rippled through the town days before, the rescue, the quiet defiance against expectation, the demonstration of true courage, had not been forgotten. The townsfolk lingered in doorways and behind windows, some hesitant, some curious, all aware that the ordinary rhythm of their lives had been upended by something both subtle and extraordinary. It had been a shock not of spectacle, but of heart, and it had left ripples that would take years to fade. They walked together now, along the edges of fields that had borne witness to generations, the land itself seeming to exhale in recognition. Her hand brushed against his as they passed a wooden fence, tentative, testing the promise of trust. He did not retreat. He met her touch with quiet warmth, steady as the wind over the plains. Words were unnecessary. The connection spoke in glances, in the shared weight of silence, in the knowledge that they had seen each other fully and chosen to remain. The first man lingered in the square, a shadow of frustration and begrudging admiration. Pride, brittle and unyielding, held him in check, preventing acknowledgement of the truth he had witnessed, that strength and bravery often reside not in domination or loud gestures, but in patient care and understanding. He turned away eventually, leaving the town to adjust slowly to the new rhythm that had entered its midst. Side characters, neighbors, elders, and children emerged into the soft light, observing without interference, feeling the shift in the atmosphere. The town, once rigid in its expectations, began to recognize a different kind of courage, the courage to care deeply, to act decisively, and to stand gently against the tide of gossip, fear, and convention. She finally turned to him fully, the rising sun painting their figures in warm gold. His eyes held hers, patient and steady, a promise without words, that whatever storms had come, whatever whispers or judgments lingered, here was safety, understanding, and quiet steadfastness. A soft smile curved her lips, the kind that blooms slowly, carrying with it relief, hope, and the recognition of love in its most enduring form. They paused atop a low hill, looking down over the town, the plains stretching endlessly beyond. The world felt expansive, yet intimate, as if the land itself remembered the moments of courage and care that had taken place upon it. And in that remembrance, they found forgiveness, not just for each other, but for the judgments of a world slow to understand, for the mistakes of those who could not see beyond their own pride. The wind lifted gently, carrying the faint scent of flowers and earth, brushing the edges of their hair, caressing the landscape with the quiet understanding that life, though often harsh, always offered moments of grace. In this shared calm, the heroine felt the stirrings of peace within her chest, the pulse of trust and hope, the certainty that someone had arrived who would walk beside her in the quiet, as well as the storms. The town would speak of the rancher's act for years, of the shock it had brought and the gentle defiance it embodied. But more importantly, she knew this. Hearts remembered what courage looked like when expressed softly, when care triumphed over spectacle, when love grew without demand. And in the fold of that knowledge, she allowed herself to hope, to trust, to step forward into a life reshaped not by the judgments of others, but by the steady, unwavering rhythm of two hearts choosing each other. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling light across prairie and town alike, she turned to the audience of life itself, a quiet truth blooming in her chest. Courage can be gentle, love can be steadfast, and the human heart remembers most vividly the acts of care that defy the world. Quietly, insistently, and beautifully.